Welcome and thank you for joining us for this podcast series, Let's Talk Water New Mexico. This is our first episode of 6 put together by the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. I am one of your hosts, Liz Jolly.
And I am your other host, Evan Lamoureux. And Liz and I are very excited to kick off this series of podcasts focused on the challenges and opportunities for using non-traditional water resources to help address the ongoing challenges with our freshwater supply in New Mexico. The New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium is focused on seizing the opportunity to solve water challenges with innovation and collaboration.
That's right, Evan. As we all know and experience daily, water is a valuable resource, and there's a lot of challenges that not only New Mexico, but other states right now are facing, balancing between supply and demand. And today, we're going to focus on some of the challenges on the water supply side, driven specifically by some of the changes in the climate. But before we go any further, we'd like to introduce our first guest, John and D'Antonio and Dave Dubois. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And let's spend a minute and see if both of you will introduce yourself and provide a bit of background on how you're related to water. John, let's start with you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for providing this opportunity for us. I'm a native New Mexican, so born and raised in Albuquerque, went to school at the University of New Mexico, got a degree in civil engineering. And my very first day on the job, I was a hydraulic design engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I've really been involved in water from that perspective, designing dams and flood control structures, doing those types of things. Later on in my career, I got involved with water policy issues, took some other classes at the University of New Mexico that delved into water management and really started working with the Corps of Engineers. So I kind of split my time between the Corps of Engineers and the state of New Mexico, became state engineer. I have worked under 4 different governors in managing the waters of the state of New Mexico. So a long career in design, administration, policy, and continue to do so now in the private sector. So I'll stop there and I'll let Dave introduce himself.
Great, John. I'm glad to be here. This is Dave Dubois. I am the state climatologist for New Mexico, and I'm physically down in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I'm also a faculty member at New Mexico State University. And I do a lot of work in kind of an advisory role and talking to various agencies and individuals, particularly in agriculture, dealing with water management and talking about how we deal with droughts. Probably we'll talk about that later in this podcast. And so I've been doing mainly research. I've been doing a lot of teaching recently, but I've been doing this for about 25 years and really enjoy work in atmospheric science, especially in New Mexico. But there's a lot of challenges, and that's kind of what makes my job really interesting is the challenges with water and drought, and it's particularly a changing climate. So good to be here.
John, you're our water expert, and Dave, you're our climate expert. So you guys are great guests to have in this first podcast to help us set the stage for the future episodes. And so just to kind of set the stage, we are going to talk first about the current water situation in the Southwest and more specifically in New Mexico and how that's going to tie into our later conversations. So first, John, can you start just kind of painting a picture for the audience what the current water situation is in New Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you basically, and Liz mentioned this earlier, water is the most important commodity in New Mexico. Obviously, it's important to our state. We do have a lot of challenges, as Liz had mentioned. Currently, just to give a little bit of background, the surface water is fully appropriated within the state of New Mexico. And so our water is really accounted for. Most of the groundwater basins they have all been established, but there are some areas where you could go for additional appropriations, but there's not many. And I think as we look at the water use in New Mexico, about 75% of it is water that's available for agricultural use, and the other remaining 25% is split between other industrial use, other commercial, industrial, power, mining, livestock, those types of things. When we break those things out, it's kind of surprising. The water supply in domestic use is a little less than 10%. And if you look at reservoir evaporation, which is really not a use, but there's 7.4% of the water is evaporated from our lakes and rivers. And then you have commercial and industrial power is only 6.3% to make up the 100%. So it's pretty interesting on how we use water. And these numbers come from water that's diverted from State Engineer Water Use and Conservation Bureau reports that happen every 10 years.
Wow, John, that really surprised me. I had no idea that 75% of the water was allocated to agriculture and really how small the personal use of all the water consumption is. Can you give us a flavor as to how much water volume we're talking about?
Absolutely. So back in 1995, we actually diverted, again from these same documents from the state engineer's office, about 4 million acre feet of water, which was roughly half surface water and half groundwater. In 2015, so 10 years later, the water diversion was only about 3 million. So there was a drop of almost 1 million acre feet. And the reduction, that 29% reduction was mainly attributable to irrigated agriculture. So when we look at those numbers now, we're use about, and I say use, we divert about 3.1 million acre feet of water. Again, it's split up relatively half surface water and half groundwater. And so we are very concerned about some of the limited supply that we have over time. And that's kind of where we're going to get to when we start looking at opportunities for additional water within the state of New Mexico. It's not going to come from any additional surface or groundwater. It's got to come from other areas, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, I find it extremely interesting that all of our water is basically accounted for. Just puts a lot of pressure on the balance there, and is something I obviously took for granted. I turn on the water faucet and water's there. So it's interesting to hear that fact. So as you were talking, John, you kind of got me thinking about how New Mexico compares to maybe other states. Is there anything that we'd want to touch on there about the specific nature of New Mexico? Is that a common challenge in all the other states of that delicate balance?
We do manage our surface and groundwater conjunctively. And so when you take a gallon out of the ground, depending on how close you are to a surface water source, you actually do affect that surface water source by that gallon of water that's taken out. And so it's really important to manage those two sources, ground and surface water, what we call conjunctively or together. As far as New Mexico goes, I mean, we manage our water resources as well or better than anybody just because we have to. We're the most hydrologically challenged state. I mean, a lot of people say Nevada's a little drier, but they actually use they have more surface water at their disposal than we do as the state of New Mexico. So we're the most hydrologically challenged states in the West.
John, when you say hydrologically, can you talk more about what that means?
Yeah, hydrologically means basically you get water precipitation from rain and snowpack, snow melt. That's the hydrologic cycle. Essentially is the water runs off. It runs into our rivers and streams. That water is used in agriculture and other areas. In agriculture, there's an evaporative loss component that goes back into the atmosphere. Water that's not used gets recharged back down to the groundwater. And so you have this hydrologic cycle essentially on how water is used within anywhere essentially. But that becomes the alarming prospect for us is that precipitation is becoming lower, but more than that, the temperatures are rising, and Dave will get into that. But the longer growing seasons, that makes the water use obviously more, and it's a problem for us in the state.
John, I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned that the water is fully appropriated. Has that always been the case in New Mexico? Is the demand side, how's that changing?
If you look at the appropriations in the early 1900s, the Bureau of Reclamation, other federal agencies, they came in and developed a lot of the Western United States. The only way people could come in and settle was for some control of floodwaters. Essentially, everybody in the West really depends upon spring snowmelt. That snowmelt is captured by dams and reservoirs that are man-made, that are built so that you can store water. And instead of it all running down through the springtime, you store it for future use. And agricultural communities grew in around these big, large infrastructure dams from the federal government. So in the early 1900s, especially in New Mexico, most of the surface water, all of it on the Rio Grande, was fully appropriated in the early 1900s. Same with the Pecos River. And so when you start looking at the main rivers and streams within the entire Western United States, there's really no new appropriation of that surface water. Groundwater technology and pump technology came in afterwards, and the groundwater augmented the surface water supply.
John, now talk us through what New Mexico's role is in managing the water supply. How does it work?
For every water use in the state of New Mexico, there's a state engineer permit that's required. And so when we look at uses, and you have expanding cities, the only way cities can expand to municipal and industrial use is by actually transferring the consumptive use portion of an agricultural right to a use so that our cities can grow. So if the city of Albuquerque is going to grow, essentially, there's going to have to be an adequate amount or this similar amount of surface water that's dried up so that can be transferred. That consumptive use portion can be transferred. So you're not adding additional depletions to any of our systems. And so when we look at one of the things that the state engineer put in place back in 2003, was an active water resource management. It's an alternative administration in response to prior appropriation, which in the Western United States, the senior users have the priority right for a water right. A junior use is somebody that put water to beneficial use later. And if we're short of supply, the way the rules work, essentially, the way the laws work, are that those junior users can be cut off from that water supply. That doesn't work very well in a lot of areas. And so what we try to put in place is an alternative administration, which allows for the state engineer to get all the stakeholders in a basin together. We come up with a way to do short-term transfers of water, say out of agriculture to a municipal or an industrial use, a higher economic use, for us to be able to work our way through and manage ourselves through drought scenarios. And that's the importance of that alternative administration and move the big hammer that the state engineer has just to cut off junior supply and junior uses.
That's great to hear that there's such collaboration kind of working together on it. Kind of got me thinking, is there, as we hear kind of the challenge continuing into the future, is there any focus on trying to reduce water use?
Absolutely. And all the time. I mean, we have conservation requirements that we put in place everywhere. For instance, the city of Albuquerque, they've got a surface water permit. They use San Juan Chama water, which is trans-mountain water from the Colorado system, comes through a series of tunnels. Water drops into the Rio Chama. The Rio Chama gets the water to a treatment plant in the city of Albuquerque. And when I permitted that water right back in 2002, 2003, we had some strict conservation requirements on that permit. So the city of Albuquerque was using 250 gallons per person per day. That permit required them to get down to 150 gallons per person per day within about a 10-year time frame. And they've actually done better than that. They're actually going down towards 125 gallons per person per day. So it's come down a lot. So we look at conservation in absolutely everything that we do. Doing a lot of fallowing programs when surface waters are low. The irrigation districts don't have enough water to really get a full supply. And so right now there's some programs in the lower Rio Grande and the middle Rio Grande where farmers are being paid to fallow lands to allow for water to stay within the system.
It's really interesting to hear how delicate that balance is between supply and demand and the challenges that we have on the supply side. And we wanted to tie climate into this bigger picture. Dave, start us off, with maybe the current conditions of the climate in New Mexico. You know, I've heard it referred to as drought. Can we maybe start there?
There's different types of droughts. The ones we mainly refer to as the meteorological drought, that's mainly precipitation. There's other ones are hydrological drought, agricultural, socioeconomic, and ecological. So when we look at the different, and those are each, as we go into the different types of drought, they have different impacts and different impacts over time. So meteorological drought can occur fairly quickly and disappear very quickly, whereas hydrological drought is more of the water supply and the ebb and flow of that. And then as we see, eventually we see things changing over time, you know, like the finances, you know, people's livelihoods are changed and impacted, and then over longer periods of time, the ecology, you know, bosques and, you know, the native plants. So, and for New Mexico, almost all the state, so like 98% of the state is in drought as of the latest U.S. drought monitor, and that's from July 14th, and so we're in the midst of a 20-year plus drought. Yeah, so it's something we've seen in the past and we'll likely see more in the future.
Dave, how do we define drought?
Well, basically, drought it starts from the lack of precipitation. So when we have average precipitation, we'll say we're out of drought. But as soon as we start to see a little bit less. We sort of see it as like pre-drought. The green ups don't occur right away. When then we start to see things, we don't have enough in the water in the reservoirs, and we start to see things like snowpack change. Those are more the intensity of drought. So it's a lack of precipitation. So it's not only rain, but it's also snow. So during our different seasons, we expect snow to occur, in the higher elevations earlier on, say September, October, and then we expect to see rain in the monsoon. Like we're right now, as we're recording, we're in the middle of the monsoon. There's the expectation of seeing that, and we get about different parts of the state get different percentages. So like the western side, southern New Mexico, they get about 40% of their annual precipitation from the monsoon. So if there's a drought, meaning that there's less monsoonal moisture, then that total amount, we're seeing less and less every year, or, depending on what's going on in the climate. So we're very concerned, and we, as climatologists, we like to look at every day what's going on and where are the rain gauges, what are they measuring, what are the forecasts, and so how is that impacting, agriculture, the stream flows, and everything like that.
Wow. Dave, can you talk about, I think we're all reading about hottest week yet in Europe in places, and then in the Southwest and in South Central in the US. Can you talk through really what the expectation is going forward with just the climate and the temperatures?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, with drought, it's the droughts can be better or worse depending on the temperature. So when we talk about the intensity of drought, a lot of times they're warmer droughts. So we compare like the droughts of the 1950s. They're likely drier in New Mexico, but the current drought is warmer. And so we see that impacts into more evaporation, as John mentioned, impacts to our storage. So we've seen like in 2020, the summer there was precipitation was second driest in the last 127 years. And as we get, there's also a very warm year. So we see that just intensifying drought. And so it's we catalog them and using one tool like the U.S. Drought Monitor. And we've seen that there's different categories. There's 4 categories in drought, and we've seen New Mexico, parts of New Mexico have been in this worst category, D4, in the past 14 of the last 20 years. And so it's that intensity over this current drought because of the additive impacts of the warm temperatures as well as the lack of precipitation. So we've been seeing these hot temperatures, and it's been taking a toll on things like as things green up, it gets rain, and then all of a sudden it gets hit by really high temperatures, and the plants don't do well when they're all hit right at their young stage, and it can go away very quickly.
It's easy to see how this is a problem. Just in what you guys have framed up, between the fact that water's completely appropriated and our climate, is getting hotter, we're seeing less precipitation. So let's talk a little bit about the impact that climate is having on our water supply. John, can you kind of help tie that together around what the facts that Dave was sharing and how we're actually seeing that come to life in New Mexico?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. The climate change impacts to the New Mexico water supply impact the water administration, obviously. So you have a lot of competing uses for the same water, right? So you have water related to environmentals. There's stresses that occur in parallel with water supply that's affecting the shortages for people. They also lead to conflicts between human use, maintaining some of our historic ecosystems, which is a problem. You have surface water supply shortages are induced by climate change, driving up agriculture and municipal users to rely more heavily on groundwater. So now the second and third order effects is, hey, we've got to augment our supply using groundwater. Less surface water also leads to lower recharge to some of the groundwater aquifers. And then when you have that decrease in water availability, it triggers changes of use from a lower value use to a higher value use, which is generally leads to a migration from agricultural water to municipal and industrial uses. So they have to go through that permitting process that the state engineer has in place. And that gets back to the active water resource management. If you have good information and good data, which we all rely on as water managers, we'll know what the snowpack is. We need better models to understand that snowpack is generating less supply into our reservoirs, and Therefore, in our basins, if we have a 20 or 30% shortage in our basins, we'd have to, by law, go in and cut off junior users that are the 20 or 30% most junior users. And that's where that active water resource management initiative comes in, allows us to manage ourselves through the resources. But it's a domino effect, and it definitely is a challenge for water managers. We've got to have the right information, current information. We have to have processes in place that are done beforehand so we can do some of these changes. And it all comes with a need for resources. And that's one of the other things that's really important is resourcing from the government to be able to administer these changes that we're seeing. And there are big changes.
Dave, what about from your perspective with kind of looking into the climate as well, into the future? Like, what do you see as future temperatures, and is this problem going to get better or worse?
Well, I think Dave's probably a better one to answer that, but we've seen the models that Dave's produced. We've had probably a 3-degree increase in temperature over the last 50 years, and in the next 50 years, we're looking at another 3 to 5 degrees increase. And Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, but that generates into 3 to 5% less water per year. So in 50 years, we're looking at a 15 to 25% reduction in our water supply, which we're going to have to deal with throughout the Western United States. And Dave, you can change that. You can append to that. It's what I think I've learned from the work that you guys do, come up with those numbers.
Yeah, no, you got it right, John. And that's kind of the bottom line we're seeing across New Mexico. And actually, and we share with other states. It's not just New Mexico, it's other areas. We're seeing these trends in the past, the last 40, 50 years, a half degree per decade. And some areas have 0.8 degree Fahrenheit per decade trends. And we're not really seeing anything that's going to affect that. We're just seeing that trend going up. And so it's, we need to plan for that higher temperature. So how are we going to change kind of our plans and kind of what do we need to do to be more resilient to those higher temperatures? Because that's kind of where we're headed. So, that's kind of our future. So we need to be able to adapt to it.
Well, let's summarize what we've learned here today from both of you. From what I've heard, we're in a really long 20-year drought, that it's hotter and more of our supply is evaporating, and every gallon of water is accounted for. And into the future, it looks like it's not going to get better from a climate standpoint. And so it sounds like our focus really is on conservation and finding additional supply to, again, come up with these collaborative, innovative ways to help provide water to the state of New Mexico. Dave, share with us some of your final thoughts for the listeners.
Sure. I usually provide all the doom and gloom, but I don't want to do that. My goal is not to scare or even, but there is there are some things we need to be aware of, with the higher temperatures and lack of water in the future. And like you said, we need to be figuring out ways to conserve as well as, use other alternative sources of water. Bottom line too is it's hard to make changes. We're stuck in our ways. It's hard to change our culture and the way we've been doing things. Our grandparents did it this way, we do it this way. And so I think, we need to be thinking about what needs to be done as opposed to just letting it, maybe something will change, maybe it'll get better, maybe we'll get a bunch of rain. There's always a possibility of getting more rain and could get a few really wet years, but that's not really in the, what we're seeing is, maybe seeing some short-term good stuff with snow and rain, but overall long-term, not so much. So we need to be planning for that, planning for those years when we're not going to have it, adapting to those kind of things. And it may take a lot of extra work, but I think we're going to be better off having already thought through things. And if you have a farm or ranch or manage water, there's always things to plan for. And you already are doing some of those, but it's more of looking out further in time, where are we going to be in 20 years? Maybe past our career, but somebody else is going to be dealing with it. So that's my last message.
What about from you, John?
Well, New Mexico, we have a 400-year history of communities sharing water in times of shortages. We've got tribes, pueblos, nations, acequias that have done so for hundreds of years. We've got to keep in mind that there's a private property right associated with water and water use. And I think the active water resource management allows for some flexibility. But going back to the beginning of this program, essentially the consortium, part of their charge is how do we look at new supplies of water, one being produced water, which is a byproduct of the oil and gas production. So there's a lot of interest in treating that water. So that becomes a new supply for beneficial use and something that the state engineer's office could permit that use down the road. But we've got to look at, Dave mentioned conservation. Conservation's the easiest way to save water. We have reuse and renewable resources that we can use. There's a lot of brackish water in the state of New Mexico that through filtration and through what they call a reverse osmosis process filtration, you can use some of that brackish water for other purposes. We've got some climate modification. Some of the states around us are using a lot of climate modification, which means generating additional rainfall, snowpack in the winter for mountains and reservoirs. That's something that New Mexico is only doing a limited amount of with respect to trying to increase that supply. And then you can't discount the importance of water and doing the interbasin transfers. So bulk water transfers from where we might have water to where we need water, but make sure that we have the area of origin protections. We don't want another situation that they've had in California where Owens Valley took all the water from Owens Valley, and you create this big problem from the move from location. So there's ways to do it. There's opportunities to do it, but we really have to think outside the box. And I know that's an overused term somewhat, but in New Mexico, every drop of water counts, and we've got to get creative on using these new supplies. And it's going to take money. It's going to take innovation. It's going to take a lot of scientific work and study to clean up sources and do other things. But I think New Mexico's up to it. So thank you for including us in this podcast.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Dave, for joining us and for laying the groundwork for this first episode. Thank you to our listeners for chiming in. We hope that you found this conversation interesting and educational. And we ask that you stay tuned for the future episodes where the consortium will continue to show how they're looking at and trying to seize the opportunity to solve water's challenges with innovation and collaboration. As John kind of set the stage there at the end, going to be diving into some of those alternative options and how produced water might fit in and be a solution.